There are roads that exist only on old maps, whispered about by those who claim to have seen them but never traveled them. One such road, cutting through the dense forest between two rural towns, had been erased from GPS systems years ago. Officially, it didn't exist, but locals knew better. The shortcut was real, and those who took it rarely spoke of the experience. Some never came back. Mark Patterson had heard the rumors before. A winding back road that could shave an hour off his drive home, hidden between crumbling mile markers and thick trees. It was the kind of road truckers and desperate travelers found by accident, drawn in by the lure of a quicker way. He had always ignored the stories. People talked about strange things happening there, about vanishing cars, about headlights appearing in the fog when no other vehicles were on the road. But Mark was in a hurry, and warnings meant little to a man who just wanted to get home. It was past midnight when he saw the turnoff, barely visible between two rusted road signs, their lettering long since faded. His phone had lost signal miles ago, and the main road had been eerily empty, save for the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. Without much thought, he took the turn, the tires of his sedan crunching onto cracked pavement covered in leaves. The shortcut was narrower than he expected, flanked by towering pines that seemed to lean inward, swallowing the sky above. For the first mile, nothing seemed unusual. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the road twisted in sharp curves, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Mark kept his high beams on, illuminating the jagged branches reaching toward the pavement like skeletal fingers. The deeper he drove, the more he noticed a strange sensation, a pressure in his ears, as if the atmosphere itself was growing thicker. The world outside his car felt impossibly still, as if the trees were holding their breath. Then the road changed. At first it was subtle. The asphalt, already cracked and faded, seemed older, as though decades had passed in an instant. The trees were different too, gnarled, twisted, their bark peeling in strange patterns that resembled faces screaming in silence. His headlights flickered for just a moment, a brief stutter in the glow, but long enough for him to see something, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. Mark slammed the brakes, heart hammering. The figure was gone. He peered into the rearview mirror, but there was nothing, just the dark stretch of road behind him, empty as before. He exhaled a shaky breath, telling himself it was exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Yet, the uneasy feeling in his chest only grew stronger. Pushing forward, he tried to focus on the road, but something wasn't right. The turns were becoming more frequent, looping in ways that didn't make sense. He should have been making progress, but according to his dashboard clock, he had been driving for nearly 30 minutes with no sign of an exit. The road was stretching longer than it should. Then, the real horror began. A faint light appeared in his rearview mirror. Headlights, distant but approaching. Relief flooded his chest. Another car. Maybe a local. Maybe someone who knew the way out. He kept driving, waiting for the vehicle to get closer. But after 5 minutes, the headlights remained the same distance behind him. No matter how much he sped up or slowed down, they never moved closer or further away. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. The road was still twisting, still unfamiliar. Then, without warning, the headlights behind him flickered and went out. Mark slammed the brakes again, heart pounding in his throat. Silence pressed against the car. The world outside his windows was black, his own headlights barely cutting through the thick fog that had begun to settle over the road. He felt the overwhelming urge to turn around, to retrace his steps and find the main highway again. But when he glanced at his GPS, the screen was blank, just an error message blinking mockingly at him. And then, in the absolute stillness, something tapped on his back window. Twice. Slow. Deliberate. Mark didn't dare turn around. Mark's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles pale under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. The sound had been unmistakable. 2 deliberate taps on the back window. It wasn't a falling branch, nor the wind playing tricks on him. Someone or something was outside his car. He forced himself to breathe, each inhale sharp and shallow. The world beyond the glass was suffocatingly dark, the fog swirling in dense patches that made it impossible to see past the red glow of his taillights. His mind raced through his options. He could gun the accelerator and get out of there, but where would he go? The road had already proven itself a maze, stretching longer than it should, curving back on itself in unnatural ways. Another tap, this time more forceful. Mark flinched, his pulse hammering in his throat. His body screamed for him to look, to confirm what was standing behind the car. But some deeper, more primal instinct warned him against it. If he turned around, if he made eye contact, something irreversible would happen. Instead, he reached for the gear shift with trembling hands. His foot hovered over the gas pedal. He just needed to move. Forward. Away. Then, in the silence, his radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, a whispering hum that sent a shiver crawling down his spine. Then, beneath the noise, a voice. Faint. Distorted. Don't stop. Mark's breath hitched. The voice was barely audible, like a transmission from somewhere impossibly far away. He tried to speak, but his throat felt tight, constricted by a fear he couldn't fully understand. His body moved on its own. His foot slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The tires screeched against the pavement as the car lurched forward. The rearview mirror showed nothing but swirling fog, but Mark didn't dare slow down. The road twisted wildly, each turn sharper than the last. The trees felt closer now, their crooked branches scraping against the roof of the car like desperate fingers trying to claw their way inside. Then a flash, headlights in the distance. Relief flooded his chest. Another car, maybe a trucker, maybe someone who could help. But as he sped toward the approaching vehicle, his stomach clenched with unease. The headlights weren't moving. They were completely still, hovering in the darkness like two unblinking eyes. Mark hesitated, his foot easing off the gas. Something was wrong. His hide beams barely touched the outline of the other vehicle, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The car looked familiar. Same make, same model, same dent on the front bumper. His own car was parked in the middle of the road ahead of him. Mark slammed the brakes, the sudden stop jerking him forward. His heart pounded against his ribs, his mind scrambling to make sense of what he was seeing. How could his car be in front of him when he was still inside it? The radio crackled again. This time, the voice was clearer. Turn around. Mark swallowed hard, gripping the wheel as he cast a glance in the rearview mirror. And then he saw them, figures emerging from the fog, tall, motionless, waiting. Mark's breath came in quick, panic gasps as he stared into the rearview mirror. The figures stood at the edge of the fog, unmoving, their silhouettes barely discernible against the swirling mist. There were no faces, no defining features, just tall, shadow-like forms watching. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his fingers ached. His mind screamed at him to move, to get away from the impossible scene in front of him. His own car was still parked in the middle of the road, headlights glowing dimly through the darkness. It made no sense. He was inside his car, but somehow it was also in front of him. The figures took a step forward. Mark's stomach twisted. He slammed the gear shift into reverse and floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the cracked pavement as the car lurched backward. But even as he sped in the opposite direction, the figures remained the same distance away. It was as if the road itself stretched with him, pulling him deeper into something he didn't understand. The radio crackled again, sending a burst of static through the speakers. Then, the voice returned. "You can't leave." Mark clenched his jaw. "Screw this," he muttered through gritted teeth. He jerked the wheel to the right, trying to swerve off the road into the forest. If the road wouldn't let him escape, maybe he could cut through the trees. But the moment his tires hit the dirt shoulder, his headlights flickered, and suddenly, he was back in the middle of the road, facing his own car again. His heart slammed against his ribs. He blinked, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had turned. He had driven off the road. But somehow, he was right back where he started. The figures took another step forward. His hands trembled. The road was trapping him. His car wasn't moving through space the way it should. He didn't know how, but he was being kept here, forced to repeat the same stretch of road, looping through some nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The static in the radio swelled, hissing like something alive. The voice returned, this time more urgent. "Get out of the car." Mark shook his head, panic clawing at his throat. No, that was the last thing he wanted to do. The figures were out there. Whatever was happening, he was safer inside. But then, something changed. From the other car, his car, the driver's side door slowly creaked open. Mark's blood turned to ice. Someone or something was getting out, and he had the sickening feeling that whoever stepped out of that car was him. Mark's breath hitched as the door of the other car creaked open. The sound was slow, deliberate, cutting through the suffocating silence of the road like a rusted blade. The fog curled around the opening, swallowing the space inside before revealing a figure. Then he stepped out. Mark felt the air in his lungs turn to ice. The man standing beside the identical car wasn't just similar to him. He was him. Same jacket, same jeans, same panicked expression frozen on his face. But something was off. The other Mark's movements were slightly unnatural, his posture too rigid, like a puppet whose strings were being adjusted by an unseen hand. The radio crackled violently, filling the car with white noise that made Mark's skin prickle. "Don't look away," the voice commanded through the static. Mark's body felt paralyzed. His own reflection, his living, breathing doppelganger, turned its head toward him. Their eyes met, and that was when everything shifted. A sudden, violent pain shot through Mark's skull, as if something were being ripped out of his mind. He gasped, his vision blurring, his body seizing with a cold so deep it made his bones ache. He was no longer in the car. He was outside. No, he was looking into the car. His hands pressed against the window. But when he looked down, they weren't his hands. They were someone else's. Panic flooded him as he turned his gaze to the windshield. Inside the car, gripping the steering wheel, was himself. The realization hit like a freight train. He was no longer in his own body. His doppelganger, the thing that had stepped out of the other car, was now inside, taking his place. Mark pounded on the glass, screaming, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his limbs felt sluggish, disconnected. The thing inside his car, inside his body, slowly turned to face him. Its lips curled into a knowing smirk, a cruel mockery of his own face. The headlights of the car flickered. The radio static grew louder. The figures in the fog had drawn closer, much closer. Then, without hesitation, the thing inside the car shifted into drive and floored the gas. Mark could only watch as his own car, his own body, sped off into the darkness, leaving him stranded on the endless, winding road. Mark stood frozen on the pavement, watching the taillights of his own car disappear into the dense fog. A sharp, suffocating silence followed, wrapping around him like an unseen force. The cold air pressed against his skin, and for the first time, he realized something horrifying. He could no longer feel his heartbeat. He reached up, pressing a trembling hand to his chest. Nothing. No thump. No pulse. Just an empty stillness. His breath came in ragged gasps, though even that felt wrong. He wasn't breathing, not really. He was mimicking the action, going through the motions of a body that no longer functioned the way it should. A sickening thought clawed at his mind. Was he even still alive? The figures in the fog had drawn closer. They were no longer just silhouettes at the edges of his vision. Now, he could see them clearly. Their bodies were long and emaciated, their limbs unnaturally stretched. Their faces, if they could even be called that, were smooth and featureless, like blank masks that had never been given a mouth to scream. Mark staggered backward, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs felt heavy, sluggish, like they weren't fully his anymore. The figures did not lunge, did not rush him. Instead, they simply waited. The fog curled around his ankles, thick and cloying. It whispered to him, not with words but with sensations, an aching loneliness, an overwhelming sense of being forgotten, like he had been plucked from existence itself. Then, a sound broke through the silence. Footsteps. Mark spun around, expecting to see another one of the figures, but what he saw instead made his stomach twist into knots. Someone else was walking toward him through the mist. A man, disoriented, his head turning from side to side in confusion. He was dressed in a suit, his tie loosened, his expression tense with fear. The man's gaze locked onto Mark. His eyes widened. What the hell? Before Mark could even speak, the man's body jerked violently. It was as if an unseen force had wrapped around him and pulled. His feet left the ground for a fraction of a second before he was yanked backward into the fog. Silently, effortlessly. Mark barely had time to react before another sound cut through the air. The roar of an engine. His head snapped toward the road, just in time to see a pair of headlights pierce through the darkness. A car moving fast. For a split second, hope flickered inside him. Someone else. Someone who could help. But then, as the car got closer, the hope drained from his chest. It was his car, his own vehicle, now occupied by the thing wearing his face. It sped toward him without hesitation, without slowing, and in the reflection of the windshield, Mark saw his own expression staring back at him. Cold, empty, not human. The headlights swallowed him whole. Mark braced for impact. His muscles tensed, his hands shot up instinctively, but there was no time to react. The headlights consumed him. And then nothing. No pain. No crash. No violent jolt throwing his body across the pavement. Just a weightless, sinking feeling, as if he had fallen through the earth itself. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't on the road anymore. He stood in a diner. It was the kind of roadside diner that belonged in a different decade. Chrome stools lined up against the counter, a neon sign buzzing faintly above a rack of pies, and a jukebox in the corner that crackled with static instead of music. The air smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and something faintly metallic. Mark staggered backward, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. His last memory was of his car barreling toward him, his stolen body behind the wheel. And now this? The diner was empty. No customers. No servers. Just an eerie, abandoned stillness. Then the bell above the door jingled. Mark spun around just as someone stepped inside. It was a man, middle-aged, dressed in a mechanic's uniform stained with oil. His name tag read Joe. He took one look at Mark and frowned. Not with fear, not with surprise, but with something closer to recognition. "So, you're the new one," Joe muttered. Mark's blood ran cold. "The new what?" Joe sighed, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "They always come through here sooner or later," he said, motioning toward the empty booths. "Sit. You're probably confused." Mark didn't move. His body still felt wrong, like a suit he hadn't fully stepped into. He could barely feel his own weight pressing against the ground. Joe studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "You'll figure it out. They all do." Mark's voice came out hoarse. "Who are you?" Joe leaned against the counter, tapping his fingers against the Formica surface. "Just someone who got here before you." Mark's stomach twisted. "Got where?" Joe's eyes darkened. "Nowhere." Mark's pulse, if he even had one anymore, thudded in his ears. "I need to get out of here," he said, backing toward the door. Joe didn't stop him. He just let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "Go ahead." Mark didn't hesitate. He pushed open the door, expecting to step outside into the cold night. But instead, he walked straight back into the diner. Joe sighed. "Yeah, they all try that too." Mark stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He had stepped through the diner's door expecting the night air, the winding road, the cold press of reality. But instead, he was back inside. The fluorescent lights hummed above him. The jukebox in the corner crackled with static. Joe, the mechanic, stood behind the counter, watching him with the tired patience of someone who had seen this all before. Mark's mind rebelled against what his eyes were telling him. He turned again, gripping the door handle with sweaty palms, and yanked it open. Same result. The diner, the booths, the smell of coffee, and something metallic. His pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't possible. He had walked in a straight line. He should be outside. Mark stumbled back, shaking his head. This is some kind of trick. Joe wiped his hands on his rag and gave a slow nod. "Yeah, that's what I thought at first too." Mark's stomach twisted. "You're saying you were trapped here too?" Joe chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Still am." A cold wave of dread swept over Mark. He backed up toward one of the booths, lowering himself into the cracked red vinyl seat. His hands felt like they were tingling, as though the sensation of touch itself was fading. He clenched them in a fist, trying to ground himself, trying to feel real. Joe sat across from him, resting his elbows on the table. "It's different for everybody," he said. "Some people wake up on the road. Some get pulled right off it. Some step through the fog and end up here like you." He gestured vaguely to the empty diner. "It don't matter how you got here, though. Point is, you ain't leaving." Mark's head snapped up. "That's bullshit. I can get out." His voice cracked, but he refused to believe it. "There's always a way out." Joe's expression darkened slightly. "Sure, you keep telling yourself that." The weight of those words pressed against Mark's chest, but he shoved the fear down. He had to think. There had to be a way to break this cycle. His eyes darted toward the windows, expecting to see the empty road beyond them, but his stomach dropped. There was nothing outside. Not darkness, not fog, not even the distorted shapes of trees. Just nothing. A vast, featureless void stretched beyond the diner's glass. An emptiness so complete it made his head throb just looking at it. It was as if the world itself had ended beyond these walls. Mark's breathing became shallow. "What the hell is this place?" Joe shrugged. "Depends who you ask." Mark's voice was barely a whisper. "And if I ask you?" Joe leaned forward, his voice low and even. "I'd say it's where people go when they were never supposed to leave that road." Mark felt the diner pressing in around him, like it was alive, like it was watching, and deep in his gut, he knew this wasn't just a roadside stop. It was a trap. Mark sat frozen in the cracked vinyl booth, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The weight of Joe's words pressed against him like unseen hands, gripping, suffocating. This was a place for those who were never supposed to leave the road. But that didn't make sense. Mark had been there, on the road. He had felt the pavement under his shoes, heard the hum of the wind through the trees. He had been real, alive, hadn't he? Joe watched him, his face unreadable. The mechanic didn't seem cruel, nor did he seem eager to explain anything further. He simply sat across from Mark, drumming his fingers against the chipped tabletop in slow, rhythmic beats, waiting for the inevitable storm of questions. Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. "How long have you been here?" Joe exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly as if considering his answer. "Hard to say. Could be years. Could be minutes. Tom don't work right here." Mark shivered. "And what about the others?" Joe's drumming fingers stopped. The diner, already eerily quiet, grew even quieter. The jukebox, still humming with static, seemed to hold its breath. Mark felt the change in the air before Joe even spoke. "There were others," Joe said finally. Mark's mouth went dry. "Where are they now?" Joe hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the empty booths, toward the hollow silence of the diner. It was as if the very walls of this place were holding secrets just out of reach. "Some tried to leave," he said, voice quieter now. "Some stopped trying." Mark's stomach churned. The vagueness of the answer was worse than the truth could ever be. He wanted to press further, but some instinct told him that he didn't want to know. Instead, he turned his attention back to the door, the one that had led him here, the one that had betrayed him when he tried to leave. He studied its frame, its dull brass handle. From this angle, it looked just like any normal door. It was only when you stepped through that the lie unraveled. Mark's hands clenched into fists. There has to be a way out. Joe let out another dry chuckle, rubbing his temple as if he had heard that 1,000 times before. "Sure, kid. There's always a way out." Mark's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Joe shrugged. "Depends on how much you're willing to risk." Mark leaned forward. He didn't care if this man thought he was desperate. He was. "Tell me." Joe locked eyes with him, his gaze heavy. "There's a door out back, but you don't want to open it." Mark's skin crawled. He hadn't even thought about the possibility of another door. His gaze flickered toward the dimly lit hallway leading past the kitchen. Shadows pooled in the corners, shifting in ways they shouldn't. "What's back there?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Joe held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "The ones who never left." Mark's breath came shallow as he stared down the dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with something he couldn't name. Not just dust, not just silence, but something older, something waiting. Joe's words clung to him like cold sweat. The ones who never left. His fingers twitched against the tabletop. His body screamed for him to stay put, to accept the impossibility of this place, and sink into the quiet madness that had swallowed Joe. But his mind was still clawing for logic, for an exit. "There's always a way out," Mark muttered under his breath, as if saying it aloud would make it real. Joe sighed. "I wouldn't do it if I were you." Mark's chair scraped against the linoleum as he stood. His legs were unsteady, but his resolve held firm. If there was a way out, he had to try. Joe watched him with something between pity and exhaustion. "You think you're the first?" Mark hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he turned, walking toward the hallway, toward whatever truth lay beyond that back door. The deeper he went, the worse it got. The walls seemed to lean inward, the ceiling pressing down as if the very structure of the diner was conspiring against him. The hum of the jukebox faded behind him, swallowed by the growing silence. The kitchen was a ruin of cold metal and long-dead appliances. A deep, lingering smell of rot curled through the air, though the surfaces were eerily clean. No dishes, no food, nothing to suggest that this place had been used in years. Mark reached the end of the hallway. There it was. A steel door, rusted at the edges, a heavy-duty exit sign flickering above it. He reached for the handle, but his fingers hovered just short of touching it. The metal was cold, so cold that he could feel its unnatural chill radiating through the air. A noise. Not behind him, beyond the door. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't knocking. It was breathing. Something deep, wet, and wrong moved behind that door, its presence heavy and thick like a shadow given form. It was waiting. Joe's voice drifted through the silence. "You open that door. You don't come back?" Mark turned his head slightly, seeing Joe standing at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, face unreadable. He hesitated. Then his hand closed around the handle, and he pulled. The door creaked open with a low, metallic groan, the sound making Mark's spine stiffen. For a moment, he hesitated, caught between the pull of something dark and foreboding and the raw desperation gnawing at him. Every instinct told him to turn around, to go back to the diner, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But there was no turning back now. The room beyond the door was dark, and not just dim, but utterly consumed by shadow. The light from the hallway didn't penetrate the space beyond the threshold. It simply vanished. Mark's eyes strained, trying to adjust, but nothing helped. It was as if his senses were being swallowed whole, as though the air itself was thickening, making it harder to breathe. The smell of rot that had hung in the kitchen seemed more concentrated here, more intimate. Then he heard it, a soft shuffle, a whisper. The floor beneath his feet felt unstable, and as he took a step forward, the air seemed to thicken even more. His heartbeat hammered in his ears. Whatever was in there, it was alive. It was moving. Mark's legs felt heavy. His hand, still gripping the door, trembled as it began to swing wider. The oppressive weight in the air intensified with every inch. He took another step, his body fighting him with every movement, but his mind was consumed with a single thought. "I have to know." The shuffle grew louder, closer. A low, raspy sound. Mark's breath was caught in his throat when he finally crossed the threshold fully. The door swung shut behind him, locking him in, sealing him off from the diner, from Joe, from everything. He turned sharply, but what he saw made him stagger back, almost tripping over his own feet. The walls of the room were lined with figures, shadowy, twisted shapes, half-formed, barely human. Their faces were obscured, their bodies unnatural, broken in ways that made Mark's stomach churn. Their eyes, though, were unmistakable. Empty, hollow, but they were looking at him. The room felt smaller now, claustrophobic. His chest tightened. The figures didn't move. They didn't speak. But Mark could feel their gaze, heavy and suffocating. Each step he took seemed to bring him closer to a reckoning he was not prepared for. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shuffle stopped. A new noise took its place. The sound of something breathing, deep and labored. It echoed in the room, and Mark's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He could feel the air shift around him, thickening, pressing in like it was trying to pull him deeper into the darkness. Then, from the farthest corner of the room, a figure began to move. It was slow at first, its movements jerky, disjointed, like it was struggling to push against an invisible force that wanted to keep it still. But it was coming for him. Mark stumbled backward, his head spinning. The breathing in the room had changed, growing quicker, more erratic. He realized then what he had done. He had crossed into a space that was never meant to be entered. And now, the door was no longer an option. He could feel it, the pressure of the room closing in on him, pushing him deeper into something ancient, something that had always existed here. And the figure, its slow, deliberate approach, grew closer, the raspy breath louder with each step. Mark's feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to run, to find some way out of the dark. But his body betrayed him. He was trapped in the space between terror and disbelief, caught in the gravitational pull of whatever had been waiting in the room behind the door. The figure's movement grew more distinct now, each step heavy with purpose. Its body was an amalgamation of shapes, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, a grotesque parody of humanity. The air grew denser, and Mark could feel the oppressive weight of its gaze pressing against him. The creature didn't speak, but the silence between them grew deafening, a sharp contrast to the rapid beating of his own heart. It stopped, just a few feet away, and for a moment, everything was still. The room held its breath, and Mark's chest tightened. What was it waiting for? Mark dared not move. The figure's face was obscured, wrapped in shadow, but its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to draw him in, as if they were calling to him. The figure's breath came in slow, deliberate gasps, ragged and desperate, like something that had been waiting for years, perhaps longer. Mark could feel something inside him, something primal, telling him to look away, to run, to not give in to the pull of whatever was drawing him to this creature. But his feet remained rooted, the floor under him like quicksand, sucking him into the depths of the room. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but it was no use. The logic of the outside world didn't apply here. The silence between them stretched longer than it should have, and Mark realized with a growing sense of dread that he was no longer in control. His thoughts felt scattered, broken apart by the weight of this place. He didn't even know if he had the strength to fight it. The figure's breath grew louder, more urgent, a rasping sound that made his skin crawl. And then, without warning, the creature reached out, its hand extending toward him. Mark flinched, his breath caught in his throat, but his legs didn't move. The hand stopped just in front of him, the tips of the fingers twitching, as if testing the air. And then the room seemed to shift. The shadows around him deepened, curling in on themselves, pulling tighter. Mark's head spun, and for a moment, he thought he might faint. The pressure in the room increased until his lungs felt like they were being crushed. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. It was as if the very air was pressing against him, willing him to surrender to the dark. And then the creature spoke. Its voice was a guttural rasp, an unearthly sound that vibrated through the walls and into Mark's bones. "You're not supposed to be here," it hissed. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The air around him seemed to steal his voice, leaving only the sound of his frantic heartbeat. The figure's lips curled into a twisted grin, and Mark's heart skipped a beat. "You should have stayed with the others," it said, the words chilling him to the core. "They never left either." Not really. Mark's legs finally moved. He didn't think, he just reacted. He spun around, slamming his hands against the walls, searching for any sign of a way out. But the room had shifted again, and the walls closed in, making the space seem even smaller than it had before. The shadows were alive, twisting and reaching toward him. There was no escape. The room was no longer the same. What had once been a cramped space of endless shadow had transformed into something far more terrifying. A maze of twisted corridors, each darker and more suffocating than the last. The walls seemed to be alive, breathing in and out, contracting with every shudder of Mark's body. The air was thick, saturated with a heaviness that made every breath feel like it required effort. He could taste the decay now, that same foul rot, but it was sharper here, more insistent. Mark didn't stop running. He didn't care if his legs felt like they were giving way beneath him. The thought of stopping, of slowing down, was unthinkable. His mind screamed at him to keep moving, to find a way out, even though he knew deep down that there was no way out. The hallway stretched endlessly in front of him, its walls bending and warping, an impossible landscape that stretched beyond reason. He had to fight it, but what was it? The room? The creature? The very place itself? Was this the end of the road, or just another trick? A part of him, deep inside, doubted the reality of everything he had seen. But another part of him, the part that had sensed that something was always wrong from the beginning, now recognized the truth. He had already passed beyond any boundary that would ever bring him back to what he knew. The thought was suffocating, and Mark's chest felt as if it might cave in at any second. He needed answers. He needed to know what was happening, what had been happening since he first stepped through that back door. But the more he ran, the more his sense of direction unraveled. The hallways seemed to curve, reform, and swallow him whole, each turn leading him into another impossible dead end. "Why won't you let me go?" he whispered aloud, though he wasn't sure if anything was listening. His voice cracked in the silence, breaking the stillness like a stone shattering glass. His feet carried him to a doorway that had not been there a moment ago. He reached for the handle with shaking hands, as if instinct had guided him here. The door swung open with a slow creak, the kind of sound that made every nerve in his body sing with dread. Beyond it was a small room, almost too familiar, with a flickering overhead light that buzzed in a way Mark recognized. It was a part of the diner, one of the back storage rooms he'd passed when he'd first entered. The moment he stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through his bones. His heart skipped a beat. He spun around, expecting to find the same grim hallway. But the room before him was a prison in itself, lined with shelves of old, decaying goods and scattered objects that didn't belong here. And yet, there was a strange sense of calm about it, as if it had accepted him into its fold. He moved cautiously through the room, but something was wrong. The air, it felt different, thicker. It was heavier here too, but in a way that familiarized him with his surroundings. There were objects on the floor that he swore he had never seen before, some of them familiar, others too foreign to name. He bent to examine a rusted object on the floor, fingers grazing against the cold metal. His breath caught in his throat. It was a key, but not just any key. A small, tarnished key, worn down by time, yet its shape seemed intimately familiar. Mark had seen it before, but where? And then he remembered. That key was on the keyring Joe had handed him when he first arrived at the diner, one of the many that had been shoved into his hands without explanation. He had wondered at the time why the keyring felt so heavy, why Joe seemed so urgent in getting him to keep it. But now, the realization was clear. The key had always been part of the puzzle. He clutched it tightly in his hand, the cold metal biting into his palm, and turned to face the room once again. Everything around him seemed to shift. The room was not the same. The walls, the objects. It was as though they were rearranging themselves in his mind. His vision flickered between the present and the past, the diner merging with the shadows, the hallway where he'd once been. He could see the faces of the figures he had passed, could hear the soft shuffle of their feet as they followed him. But they weren't there. The key in his hand felt like it was burning, the metal growing unbearably hot. He shoved it into his pocket, hoping to rid himself of the oppressive feeling, but it wouldn't let go. There was something he was missing, something essential, something too terrifying to acknowledge. And that's when he heard it, the low murmur of voices behind him. They were soft at first, indistinct, but quickly grew louder. The murmurs turned to whispers, then to guttural voices, the same rasping tone that had haunted him in the hallway. Mark turned, his body frozen in place as the shadows around him thickened. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in as the figures that had once stood still now moved toward him. But this time, they didn't stop. They reached out. Mark's pulse raced. The shadows surrounding him had already thickened into a tangible, suffocating force, creeping closer, almost as if they had a mind of their own. His heart hammered against his ribcage. But no matter how hard he tried to pull in air, the weight of it all was too much. He had expected the figures to advance, to draw nearer with every breath he took, but instead, everything stilled. It was as though the world itself had frozen in place. The voices had stopped. The whispers that had grown so insistent just moments ago were gone. Even the soft hum of the flickering light above him had died down, leaving him in a deafening silence. It was strange, unsettling, even because the quiet that followed felt more dangerous than any noise could have been. The absence of sound created a vacuum, a tension that seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken threat. Mark stood perfectly still, terrified of making even the smallest move, for fear that the silence itself might swallow him whole. In the quiet, his thoughts were louder than ever before. Every detail of the room, every insignificant corner he hadn't noticed before, now seemed to loom with an oppressive weight. The key still burned in his pocket, the metal almost too hot to touch. Time stretched and warped. It felt like hours had passed, but he couldn't tell. The walls around him had taken on a strange, liquid quality, bending and undulating as if the very fabric of reality were being distorted. Mark's legs were like lead, unwilling to move, trapped by a sensation he couldn't quite comprehend. There was no escape here, not in the way he had hoped. But then something shifted, just a slight tremor at first, imperceptible. The air grew heavier, and the walls seemed to expand outward, pushing against him as though they were trying to push him back. Mark's chest tightened, the same suffocating pressure that had gripped him earlier returning with a vengeance. Something in the room was awakening, and he was no longer alone. From the farthest corner, a figure emerged, not the grotesque shadow from before, but something far more familiar, something that shouldn't have been possible. Joe, the man who had been there when Mark arrived, the one who had handed him the key, now stood in the corner of the room, staring at him with a blank expression. Mark's first instinct was to call out, to rush toward him, but something in Joe's eyes kept him rooted in place. There was no warmth in them, no recognition. Joe stood there, motionless, his eyes locked onto Mark with a cold, eerie intensity. It was as though he wasn't really there, but instead, a part of something far greater, something darker. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt tight, as though the very act of vocalizing had been forbidden in this place. The silence deepened, growing heavier with each passing second. "You shouldn't have come back," Joe finally spoke, but his voice was different. It was hollow, distant, as if the words had traveled through a void before reaching Mark's ears. There was no trace of the warmth he had once shown, no recognition of the friendship that had seemed so genuine only hours before. Mark's mind raced. Had he really come back? Was this a new reality, or was he still trapped in some nightmare? His eyes flicked to the key in his pocket. Joe's voice seemed to echo through his mind, repeating the same phrase. "You shouldn't have come back." The words resonated in his skull, like the ringing of a bell that refused to stop. The room seemed to close in once more, the walls constricting as if they were punishing him for this revelation. Everything felt wrong. He could no longer trust his senses. How was Joe here? Was this the same Joe he had met at the diner, or had he been replaced by something else? Something that wore his face, his voice, but wasn't really him at all? "Joe," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. The word tasted bitter on his tongue, like a half-remembered dream. The figure in front of him tilted its head, a faint glimmer of recognition flashing in its eyes. But it was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You're not supposed to be here," it repeated, this time with more urgency, more force. Mark felt the ground beneath him shift again, as if the very floor he stood on was being rearranged, remade, but the movement was subtle enough that he couldn't tell exactly what was happening. The atmosphere had become thick with a strange, oppressive force, and he had to fight the impulse to turn and flee, though he wasn't sure where he would run. Everything he had known about the world, about the diner, about the road was breaking apart. Mark's mind struggled to hold on to anything solid. Was this a trap? A place between realities? Was this his punishment for whatever had happened the day he walked into the diner? "Leave!" Joe's voice rang out, more forceful now, almost as if the figure before him was begging. "You won't survive here. None of us do." The warning felt like a final, irreversible blow to Mark's tenuous hope. This wasn't just about escaping the diner. This wasn't just about finding his way back to safety. No, this was about escaping a reality that was unraveling, and Mark had no idea how he was supposed to fix it. Mark's breath caught in his throat, his mind a jumbled mess of confusion and fear. His heart raced, each beat a violent reminder of the uncertainty that gripped him. He had no clear understanding of what was happening. The road, the diner, the mysterious key. None of it made sense anymore. What Joe had said echoed in his mind, repeating like a broken record. "You shouldn't have come back." Was there a truth hidden in those words? And if so, what did they mean for him? The very air around him felt charged with an unspoken dread, an impending sense of something monstrous and unavoidable. Mark could feel the tension building, crawling up his spine, his body poised for something. He wasn't sure what. But the stillness of the room was not comforting. It was suffocating. The silence was no longer just a void of sound. It felt like an entity, something watching, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He glanced toward Joe, or at least what looked like Joe, still standing in the corner of the room with that vacant stare. The more Mark looked at him, the more he realized that there was nothing human about the figure in front of him. Joe's eyes had become hollow, distant, as though his very soul had been drained, leaving behind only an empty vessel. The familiarity of his face did little to soothe Mark's mounting panic. "Why?" Mark finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse, breaking the silence. His legs trembled, but he forced himself to take a step forward. "Why are you here? What's going on?" Joe's lips twitched, but no smile came. Instead, a cold, emotionless tone filled the air as he spoke. "You don't understand, do you? You've already crossed a line. There's no going back now." Mark's mind reeled with the implications of those words. What line had he crossed? Had coming back to this place, whatever this place was, been the mistake? The thought that he might not be able to leave was a nightmare he hadn't yet dared to fully consider. But here, in this room, it was becoming undeniable. Escape wasn't an option. The room seemed to close in on him, its walls pressing tighter, the oppressive atmosphere thickening with every passing second. It wasn't just the air that felt heavier. It was the space itself, warping and twisting around him. His surroundings were no longer stable. The once familiar diner had become a distorted reflection of itself, a place suspended in some horrific limbo. In the distance, the faint sound of an engine echoed through the air. A car? A truck? Mark couldn't tell. The noise was almost inaudible, but it brought with it a strange sense of hope, a signal that there was still something outside of this suffocating reality. He turned his head sharply, but the sound faded as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the oppressive silence once more. The key in his pocket burned against his skin. Mark felt its presence as if it were some heavy burden, weighing him down, reminding him of his inability to escape. Was it the key to his freedom, or was it a trap, an instrument of his undoing? It seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't understand, almost as if it had a life of its own. Without thinking, he pulled it out, the cold metal cold against his fingertips. The moment he held it in his hand, he felt a strange pull, like the key was drawing him towards something, pulling his very soul in a direction he didn't want to go. His fingers tightened around the key, and for a split second, the room seemed to bend around him. The walls rippled, and the ground seemed to quiver beneath his feet. Mark blinked, and the distorted world around him snapped back into place. He was still standing in the diner, still facing the empty-eyed figure of Joe. But something had changed. The air was thicker, charged with an uneasiness that made his stomach churn. His grip on the key tightened even more, almost instinctively, but it wasn't enough to calm his growing sense of dread. The silence hung heavy, and for a moment, Mark felt as though he had entered a new reality, one where time moved differently, one where the rules of the world no longer applied. The road outside, the endless stretch of dark asphalt, felt so far away, as though it were a part of a world he no longer belonged to. You can't stay here forever. Joe's voice broke through the thick silence, its hollow resonance sending a shiver down Mark's spine. You'll have to make a choice. There's no going back now. Not for you. Not for anyone. Mark's mind struggled to process the enormity of what was being said. A choice? What was he supposed to choose? He had already chosen once. He had walked down that road, driven by an impulse he couldn't fully explain. But the consequences of that decision were rapidly unfolding, and he was completely unprepared. His eyes darted to the exit. The door seemed as far away as the horizon itself, the thought of it almost laughable. He could feel the weight of the key in his hand, the promise of something that he didn't yet understand but had a strange pull on his very being. The road outside was still waiting, but it was no longer the same road he had traveled before. It had become something else, something dark, unfamiliar, and terrifying. Mark took a step toward the door, his body trembling with uncertainty, but he knew deep down that whatever awaited him beyond it would not be what he expected. The world he was stepping into wasn't the one he had left behind. The road ahead was something else entirely. As Mark stepped toward the door, the weight of his decision was unbearable. The key still burned in his hand, as though it held a power that was neither completely of this world nor the next. He paused for a brief moment, glancing over his shoulder at the figure of Joe, whose hollow eyes never left him. The air between them thickened with unspoken tension, an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Joe didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to communicate the gravity of the situation. Mark felt it, a deep, gnawing feeling in his gut that told him everything had already changed. The world around him was no longer what it had been. The diner, the road outside, and even the key were mere symbols of a larger, more insidious truth that he couldn't yet comprehend. But as he reached for the door, an odd sense of clarity washed over him. This was it. This was the moment he had been teetering on the edge of for so long. The point of no return. Mark understood, with a chilling certainty, that everything he had known was crumbling. His life, his identity, his past, they were slipping through his fingers like sand. He stepped outside. The chill night air hit him like a physical force, but it was not the cold that made him shiver. It was the stillness. The road stretched endlessly before him, dark and empty. The way he had come now, a forgotten memory. The night sky overhead was oppressive, like a suffocating blanket, and yet, somehow, he felt a strange sense of peace. The road was waiting for him. The road he had once feared now drawing him in with an almost magnetic force. The sound of his footsteps on the gravel was the only sound that broke the silence, a reminder of his solitude. The wind whispered through the trees, but it wasn't the wind that chilled him. It was the realization that the road ahead was not just a physical path. It was a metaphor, a symbol of every choice he had made up until now, and every choice he was yet to face. The further he walked, the more the world seemed to distort around him. It was then that the question hit him like a sudden shock. Was he walking toward salvation or damnation? Was the key, the thing that had haunted him, the only way out? Or was it part of some larger, unknowable trap? He didn't have answers. He only had the urgency of the moment, the compulsion to keep moving forward. The road seemed to stretch on for miles, and yet, the more he walked, the closer it seemed to get to some inevitable destination. He didn't know where he was headed. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. But as he moved forward, an uncomfortable feeling gnawed at him. It was as though the road itself was shifting beneath his feet, pulling him in ways that didn't make sense. Time itself seemed to warp. The moments stretched and contracted as though the boundaries of reality were blurring, and Mark could feel himself teetering on the edge of something far beyond his comprehension. There was no turning back. Mark had understood that the moment he had set foot outside the diner. But now, with every step he took, the truth of his situation became clearer. He had made a choice, perhaps not consciously, but a choice nonetheless. The road ahead was no longer a metaphor for simply moving forward in life. It was a path to something darker, something twisted. And yet, despite everything, he couldn't help but feel drawn to it. The wind began to howl, the sound picking up in intensity. It was as though the world itself was angry at him, or perhaps it was a reflection of his own inner turmoil. The key in his hand pulsed again, its power undeniable. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a key to a door. It was a key to some new, horrifying chapter in his life. But which chapter? What was waiting for him? As he continued walking, Mark tried to focus on the road, on the path ahead. But his mind kept returning to Joe's warning. "You shouldn't have come back," Joe had said. Was this his fate? Was this the inevitable outcome of his return to this cursed place? Mark didn't know the answer, but he felt it closing in on him, like a storm gathering on the horizon, its winds growing stronger with each passing moment. There was no choice but to keep walking. The road was calling to him, pulling him forward with a force that he couldn't understand. Each step was an affirmation of his will, but also a surrender to something far beyond his control. The world around him seemed to close in, the trees and the night air pressing in as though trying to swallow him whole. And yet, there was no other option. There was no stopping now. He couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when the road had already claimed him. As Mark continued down the road, the sensation of isolation intensified. It was as though the very air around him had thickened, each breath more laborious than the last. The familiar scenery, the barren trees, the disorienting darkness seemed to fold in on itself, trapping him in a place that was neither here nor there. The world outside felt like a dream that was losing its coherence with each passing step, leaving Mark with only a sense of unease. The gravel underfoot was no longer simply a path. It had become a lifeline, a thin thread pulling him through the ever-expanding chasm of uncertainty. He looked ahead, but the road stretched on endlessly, its twists and turns taking him deeper into a darkness that seemed to have no end. And yet, for all its foreboding, there was a pull to it, a magnetic force that he could not ignore. His hand still gripped the key. The cold metal seemed to vibrate in his palm, a constant reminder of the decision he had made to continue this journey. It was no longer just an object. The key had become something of a totem, a physical manifestation of the choices he had made and the ones still left to make. What door would it unlock, and what would be waiting on the other side? He couldn't know, but the question gnawed at him, like a persistent whisper in the back of his mind. As Mark walked, he began to notice subtle changes in the environment around him. The trees, which had once been skeletal and lifeless, now seemed to sway unnaturally. The air, once still and oppressive, had a slight unnatural hum to it. It wasn't a noise exactly, but more like a presence, something vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of human hearing. Mark paused, uneasy. He was being watched. He couldn't explain how he knew this, but every instinct in his body screamed that he was not alone. Turning around, he saw nothing but the black stretch of road behind him, but he could feel the weight of unseen eyes. The stillness was thick, and the darkness seemed to move, as if alive, creeping along the edges of his vision. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but the road ahead remained unchanged, beckoning him. Mark didn't have the luxury of hesitation. The pull of the road was too strong. The further he went, the less it felt like a decision he was making. It felt almost predestined, as though the road was the one that was guiding him, not the other way around. But even in the midst of his mounting fear, Mark's curiosity grew. He had been drawn to the key for a reason. There was something important about it. A promise, perhaps. He couldn't be sure, but he knew that unlocking whatever door was meant for could give him the answers he so desperately sought. His thoughts were interrupted when, up ahead, the faint glow of a light appeared through the thick fog. It flickered, then stabilized, like a distant lantern in the darkness. Instinctively, Mark quickened his pace. The light beckoned to him like a lighthouse to a ship lost at sea, and his steps became more hurried. He could feel the tension rising, the weight of the unknown pressing harder with every stride. The light grew brighter, its source more distinct, but something about it didn't sit right with him. It wasn't a natural light. It had an unnatural glow, one that didn't belong in the world he knew. As he drew closer, the road beneath him began to shift, the ground rising in odd, uneven angles. The gravel that had once been a simple path now felt more like the jagged edges of a trap. He stumbled, his foot catching on a rock, but he caught himself just in time. The light, now blinding, was closer than ever, but Mark hesitated. He could feel something was wrong. This wasn't just any light. It was a lure, something designed to draw him in, to make him forget the danger lurking at the edges of the road. His mind raced, a torrent of conflicting thoughts. Should he continue? Should he turn back? But the road didn't give him the option to stop. With a final, reluctant breath, he pushed forward. The light grew brighter, pulsating now, and just as he felt as though he could reach out and touch it, the ground beneath him gave way. His feet slid, and the gravel became loose and slippery, sending him stumbling forward, unable to regain his balance. Mark crashed to the ground. For a moment, everything went black. The sound of his heart pounding in his ears was the only thing he could hear. But then, a cold sensation ran through his veins, and he opened his eyes to find himself in a completely different place. The road was gone, replaced by an expanse of barren, cracked earth. The sky overhead was not the inky blackness he had known. It was a dull gray, like the sky just before a storm breaks. The light was now gone. Mark struggled to his feet, disoriented and breathless. There were no landmarks, no signs of life, only the endless stretch of lifeless terrain. He stood alone in the center of what felt like an empty universe. His pulse quickened as the eerie silence enveloped him. The road had led him here, but it wasn't the road he had walked. It was something else, a place between places, a void where time and space seemed to bend and warp around him. The key in his hand had become cold again, heavier than before. Mark realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that whatever lay ahead was far worse than anything he had encountered. The road was no longer just a path forward. It had become a doorway to something darker, something unimaginable, and he had just stepped through it. The vast emptiness around Mark was suffocating, and yet it felt strangely familiar. The cracked earth beneath his feet seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, the ground itself betraying no sign of life or movement. His every breath felt like an intrusion in the stillness. He stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Had he fallen asleep on the road and dreamed his place? No. The key in his hand was too cold, too real, and the sensations of fear and confusion gnawing at his mind told him this was not a dream. As Mark scanned the horizon, there was nothing but the endless gray, like a canvas left untouched for too long, its color drained. The sky hung heavy and oppressive, a blanket that seemed to press down on him from all directions. It was a sky he had never seen before, devoid of stars or clouds. It was a sky that carried no promise. The land before him gave no indication of where he should go. His legs felt weak, as though the very earth beneath him was attempting to swallow him whole. Yet instinctively, he knew that standing still would accomplish nothing. The road, the pull that had led him here, was not behind him. It had faded, leaving only this strange void. And the key, it hummed with an energy he couldn't comprehend, its chill now digging into his palm like a warning. Mark's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound in the distance. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible against the oppressive silence. But as he strained his ears, he realized it was a whisper. Or perhaps more accurately, a murmuring. The sound seemed to grow louder, and with it, something began to shift in the air. It was almost imperceptible, but the atmosphere seemed to vibrate, as if the very fabric of reality was trembling. Mark turned, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the landscape remained unchanged, the whispering still elusive. Then he saw it, a flicker, a movement in the distance, far off where the gray sky met the earth. A mirage, perhaps? No, this wasn't a trick of the light. This was someone moving. Mark's heart raced as he began to walk toward the figure. Each step felt heavier, as though the ground was pushing back against him. His legs ached with each stride, but still, he moved forward, compelled by a force he couldn't explain. The figure in the distance grew clearer as he approached. It was humanoid, though its outline was distorted, as if it were made of smoke or mist, shifting and twisting with every movement. The air around it seemed to shimmer, bending and warping as though the very atmosphere was unsure of what it was witnessing. The figure didn't seem to have a defined shape, but there was a strange familiarity to it, a feeling that Mark should know this presence. When he was nearly close enough to touch it, the figure stopped moving. For a moment, everything was still. The wind, which had been absent until then, began to stir, though it was an unnatural wind, cold and biting. It whispered to him, though not in words, but in feelings, an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, a sense that this meeting had been inevitable. Mark's breath quickened. Something was wrong. The figure raised one arm slowly, its movement smooth and fluid. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the figure began to take a step forward. He wanted to step back, to turn and run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. The key in his hand seemed to pulse in response to the figure's movement, a deep vibration that resonated through his bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. Its hand reached out, and Mark felt a strange tug at his chest. It wasn't physical, not in the way that a hand might grab him, but it was a sensation like a thread pulling him forward. Before he could react, the air around him seemed to shimmer again, and the figure's form flickered, as if it was losing its solidity. "Do you understand now?" The figure's voice came through, though it didn't seem to come from its mouth. It echoed inside Mark's head, reverberating in a strange, alien tone. The voice was both soothing and terrifying, a calmness that belied the underlying tension that Mark could feel crawling along his skin. The key in his hand seemed to hum louder, responding to the words in some way he couldn't explain. "What do you want from me?" Mark's voice came out strained, as if the words themselves were being torn from his throat. The figure seemed to pause, its shape warping again. It was no longer just a silhouette, but a shifting mass of indistinct shapes, swirling in a slow, hypnotic dance. The cold air continued to press in on Mark, but the figure itself was somehow warmer, radiating an odd heat that made him feel both drawn in and repelled at the same time. "I want you to see," the figure replied, its voice now distant, as if the words were coming from somewhere far beyond the visible world. "You have always been here. The road you've traveled, the key you hold, they are all part of this place. But you must look beyond the surface, Mark. You must understand what has always been before you." Mark's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This place, this entity, he didn't understand. What did it mean by, "You've always been here"? He had just stumbled onto this road, hadn't he? Hadn't he just found the key? Yet the more he thought about it, the more his mind spun. He couldn't make sense of it, couldn't understand how any of this was possible. The figure's voice returned, softer this time, almost sympathetic. "The truth is here, Mark. It's always been here. You only need to open your eyes." As the last words echoed in his ears, the figure's shape collapsed in on itself, like smoke dissipating into the wind. The light in the distance, the cold grip of the key, the pull in his chest, all of it began to fade, dissolving into the gray nothingness. Mark stood there, alone once more, but the weight of the words lingered, pressing down on him like a shadow he couldn't escape. The air had thickened, heavy with a palpable silence that seemed to weigh on Mark's every breath. The landscape around him had once again shifted, as though the world itself had folded upon itself, leaving him standing at the edge of something far darker and far more unsettling than he could have ever imagined. There were no longer any signs of the shimmering figure or the strange pull that had drawn him here. Now, only the road remained, as if it were waiting, watching, ready to be traversed again. As Mark's feet moved slowly forward, he couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that the road itself had changed. The path was no longer the same one he had been walking. The familiar cracks and uneven surfaces had disappeared, replaced by smooth, unmarked asphalt that stretched endlessly ahead, its surface gleaming under the pale light of the void above. The atmosphere, which had been so oppressive just moments ago, now felt unnervingly serene. Yet, underneath that serenity, Mark could feel a growing tension, as though something was waiting just out of sight. His eyes flickered from side to side, scanning the vast expanse, trying to make sense of the scene before him. There were no trees or landmarks to guide him. No road signs, no distant structures to offer even a semblance of direction. It was as though he had been placed into a blank canvas, a world that existed only to disorient and displace. And yet, despite the lack of any obvious signs of life, Mark could feel that someone was watching him. It was then that a faint sound broke through the silence. It was a soft rustling, barely perceptible, as though the earth beneath his feet were stirring. Mark froze, straining his ears to listen. The rustling grew louder, coming from somewhere just beyond his reach. But every time he tried to pinpoint its source, it seemed to slip away, like a whisper carried on the wind. He continued to walk, faster now, his steps quickening in anticipation. Each footfall felt deliberate, but with every passing moment, the rustling grew louder, and Mark's heart began to race. Something was approaching. He could feel it closing in like the heartbeat of the earth itself. But what could it be? His pulse quickened, his mind racing as the sound began to crescendo. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Suddenly, there was a figure before him. The figure emerged from the mist, almost as though it had materialized from the very air itself. It was indistinct at first, faint outlines in the fog, its features too blurry to make out. But as Mark drew closer, it sharpened into focus. The figure was a man, hunched and stooped, his clothing ragged and torn. His face was obscured, hidden beneath a dark hood that cast a shadow over his features. The only thing visible were his eyes, glowing faintly, like embers burning in the darkness. The man didn't speak, but his presence was enough to freeze Mark in place. He felt drawn to the stranger, but also repelled, as though a part of him recognized the danger. The man stepped forward slowly, his gaze never leaving Mark's face, his movements deliberate but unervingly smooth, as if he were gliding over the ground rather than walking. The closer the man came, the colder the air became, until Mark could see his breath hanging in the air in front of him, a cloud of condensation in the frozen stillness. Mark's mind raced. Who was this man? What did he want? His hands clenched around the key, still tight and cold in his grip, but it offered no comfort. The figure stopped a mere foot away from Mark, his glowing eyes piercing into Mark's soul, searching for something he could not define. It was as though the man could see into his very being. Past the surface, past the fear and confusion. There was something unsettlingly familiar about him, yet Mark could not place it. Finally, the figure spoke. His voice was soft, but it resonated in Mark's ears, as though it were echoing from deep within the earth itself. You seek the truth, don't you? His words were simple, but there was a weight to them, as though they carried a hidden meaning, something Mark was not yet ready to comprehend. But truth, you see, is a path that leads to forgetting, to abandoning everything you know. It is not a path you can walk lightly. Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. He felt a chill run down his spine as the weight of the figure's words settled over him. Could this man be the key to understanding what was happening? Could he explain what had happened to the road, to the strange force that had pulled him here? The man took a step closer, and Mark instinctively took a step back, feeling a wave of dread wash over him. You already know the answers, Mark, the figure continued, his voice soft but unwavering. You've walked this road before, many times, but each time you forget, and each time you return. This is the cycle. It is the path you must follow. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to process the implications of the figure's words. This was the cycle? Had he really been here before? Had he walked this road countless times, each time forgetting, only to return again? The idea felt impossible. Yet there was something in the figure's gaze that made him question everything he thought he knew. What was this place? What was the truth he had been seeking? The man's expression shifted, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. You're close now, Mark, he said, his voice no longer soft but filled with an unsettling finality. Closer than you've ever been, but the path is still long, and the end is not what you think. With those words, the figure turned and began to fade into the mist, his form dissolving as quickly as it had appeared. The road before Mark stretched out endlessly once more, and he was left standing there, unsure of where to go next. The air was colder now, the silence heavier, as though the very world was holding its breath. Mark gripped the key tighter, feeling its chill seep deeper into his skin. He had to keep moving. He had to understand. But the more he walked, the more he felt the unsettling sense that he was not walking toward something, but rather walking away from it. Mark had long since lost track of time. The road, once a familiar path of terror and mystery, had become something else entirely. It no longer felt like a route through a haunted world, but instead a corridor stretching out into the deepest recesses of his mind. Each step he took felt like a journey through layers of memory, each layer more elusive than the last. The man, the one with the glowing eyes, had left him with more questions than answers, and now, as he walked on, those questions gnawed at him, clawing their way to the surface of his thoughts. The air was heavy once again, thicker than before, as though the world had grown more oppressive in its silence. The endless road stretched forward, its surface smooth and uninterrupted by any signposts or landmarks. No trees, no houses, nothing that would give him a sense of where he was or where he was going. It was as if he were moving through a liminal space, a place between the known and the unknown, where time had no meaning and every step felt like it might lead him into an abyss. For the first time, Mark felt the overwhelming sensation that he was not alone, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that suggested an awareness of his every move. The quiet seemed to pulse around him, as though the world itself was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. But no matter how deeply he tried to feel the presence of another, there was no trace, no shadow, no whisper, no sign that anyone or anything was there with him. Yet, the more he walked, the more it felt as though something was just beyond the periphery of his vision, always slipping away when he tried to focus on it. There was a strange, almost magnetic pull toward the horizon, a call that seemed to come from deep within him. It was as if the road itself was pushing him forward, urging him to continue. But with every step, the dread that had been simmering under the surface of his thoughts began to intensify. What was he walking toward? What awaited him at the end of this road? He had already encountered figures from his past, shadowy representations of his deepest fears and regrets, but none of them had offered any concrete answers. They had only left him more confused, more lost in a world that was no longer bound by logic or reason. The road twisted ahead of him, curving through an eerie fog that had started to gather once again, thicker this time, clinging to the ground like a thick blanket. His breath became shallow, his steps hesitant as the temperature dropped once more. It was almost as though the fog itself was alive, reaching out to caress his skin, wrapping around him in a cold embrace that seeped through his jacket and chilled him to the bone. The stillness of the air felt suffocating, as though every molecule in the atmosphere was weighed down by something unseen. As Mark continued, a faint glow began to emerge in the distance. At first, it was just a flicker, an almost imperceptible light, but it grew stronger the longer he walked. He quickened his pace, instinctively drawn toward it, hoping that it might be the answer he had been searching for. His heart raced, a mix of hope and fear building within him. Could this be the truth that had been hidden from him all this time? Could the road finally lead him to the end? The glow grew brighter, and soon Mark could make out the shape of a structure just ahead. It was an old, dilapidated building. No windows, no doors, just a towering presence that seemed to rise out of the ground itself. It was as if the very earth had given birth to it, a jagged monument to something long forgotten. The glow emanated from within, spilling through cracks in the stone that marked the building's decaying surface. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the building. The closer he got, the more the world around him seemed to distort. The fog grew thicker, the air heavier, and the glow from within the building became blinding, radiating with an intensity that hurt his eyes. He had to squint, struggling to see through the blinding light. Yet, despite the overwhelming brightness, something felt wrong. The closer he got to the building, the more he could feel the familiar chill creeping up his spine. It was then that he heard it, the soft whisper, so faint that it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, a familiar voice, his own. "Do you remember?" The voice asked, its words barely audible, but clear enough to send a wave of cold fear through Mark's veins. He stopped, frozen in place. The voice had come from within him, from somewhere deep inside, and yet it felt like it had originated from the very building itself. His mind raced. What was it asking him? Remember what? And then the answer came, not in words, but in a rush of images, flashes of his life, memories he had buried long ago, buried so deep that they no longer felt like his own. There were moments from his past, shattered pieces of his identity, that he had tried to forget. Faces, places, events, all swirling around him like fragments of a dream. It was as if the building was calling them to the surface, forcing him to confront the truth he had long suppressed. The images were overwhelming. They were not his memories alone. They were the memories of the road, of the twisted path he had walked, of the countless souls that had traveled this same journey before him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The road was not just a path, it was a prison, and he had been walking it for far longer than he could comprehend. The truth was that he had never left this place. Each step he had taken, each figure he had encountered, had been part of a cycle, a loop that repeated endlessly, trapping him in a nightmare of his own making. The building in front of him was not the answer. It was the truth he had been avoiding. The key to breaking the cycle was not in escaping the road, but in facing it, in remembering everything he had tried to forget. With that realization came the crushing weight of his own guilt. The road had never been about reaching an end. It had been about his own journey through the shadows of his past. Each twist, each turn, leading him back to the beginning, until he finally remembered. Mark stood before the decaying structure, the weight of the past crashing down upon him. The journey that had led him to this point. The winding road, the spectral figures, the endless loop of forgotten memories, had not been a path toward escape, but toward understanding. The truth had always been just beyond his reach, buried beneath layers of fear and regret. And now, standing on the precipice of his own fractured reality, he realized that the road had never been an external force at all. It had been a mirror, a reflection of his internal struggles, a test of his ability to confront the darkest corners of his soul. As the blinding light from the building pulsated around him, Mark could feel his pulse quicken. The whispers, his own voice echoing in the emptiness, seemed to pull at him, urging him to remember. It was no longer just a question of finding the truth, but of embracing it. He had tried to run from the past, to bury the pieces of his life that had shattered under the weight of his own choices. But now, they were demanding recognition. He couldn't outrun them any longer. He stepped closer to the building, each movement deliberate, each step heavier than the last. His body ached with exhaustion, but it wasn't the physical strain that burdened him. It was the emotional weight that had built up over the course of his journey. He had thought that leaving the road behind would free him, but now he understood that the road was not something that could be escaped. It was a reflection of his own guilt, his own failure to face the consequences of his actions. The real journey was not about moving forward, but about moving inward, toward a truth he had long feared to confront. As he reached the entrance of the building, the light seemed to swell around him, engulfing him in a sense of finality. There was no door, no barrier to entry, just an opening, as if the building itself was waiting for him to enter. The very air seemed to crackle with anticipation. For a moment he hesitated, but what was there left to fear? He had walked this road for what seemed like eternity, only to realize that it had all been a search for this single moment, this single truth. Taking a deep breath, Mark stepped into the building. Inside, the air was thick and stale, a musty odor clinging to the walls like a memory of something long forgotten. The room was bare, the walls crumbling, and the faint light that had drawn him here seemed to originate from nowhere in particular. It wasn't a traditional light, not in the way one would expect. Instead, it was a glow that seemed to come from the very walls themselves, from the cracks and fissures in the stone, as though the building itself was alive with the energy of every soul that had ever passed through this place. At the center of the room stood a large, circular mirror, its surface smooth and reflective, but unlike any mirror Mark had ever seen. The reflection that stared back at him was not his own, Instead, it was a distorted, fractured version of himself, one that flickered and warped with every passing second. The image was not static. It moved, shifting between different stages of his life, from childhood to adulthood, each stage more distorted than the last. His face morphed into that of a stranger, a person he did not recognize. Mark stepped closer, drawn to the mirror as if it were pulling him in. As he reached out a trembling hand to touch the surface, the reflection began to change once more. The images became clearer, more defined, until they were no longer just fragments of his past. They were memories, raw and unfiltered, memories he had buried deep within himself. There were moments of pain, of regret, of choices that had led him down this very path. The people he had hurt, the promises he had broken, the opportunities he had wasted, all of it played out in vivid, agonizing detail. And in that moment, Mark understood. The road, the figures, the voices, everything had been leading him here, to this confrontation with his own darkness. The road was not a punishment, nor a place of torment. It was a reflection of the choices he had made, a reminder that the only way to break free was to face the truth, to confront the consequences of his actions. The room began to spin as the images in the mirror grew more intense. Mark felt as though he were being pulled into the glass, as if the very fabric of his being were unraveling. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until they reached a deafening crescendo. He closed his eyes, unable to bear the sound, but the images continued to flash behind his eyelids, relentless and unyielding. In that moment, something shifted. The noise, the images, the oppressive weight of it all. It began to fade. Slowly, the mirror stopped warping, the images becoming clearer, more stable. Mark opened his eyes. He was no longer in the crumbling building. Instead, he stood on the road, the same road he had been walking for what felt like an eternity. But it was different now. The fog had lifted, the air was clear, and the road stretched out before him, not as a place of torment, but as a place of release. The figures, the shadows that had once plagued him, were gone. The haunting presence of the road had dissipated, leaving behind only silence. For the first time since his journey had begun, Mark felt a sense of peace. He had faced the darkness within himself, and in doing so, had broken the cycle that had held him captive for so long. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. The road had led him to this moment, and in that moment, Mark realized that the end of the road was not a destination. It was a beginning of understanding, of acceptance, and of freedom. The road was no longer a prison, it was a passage. And as he took his first step forward, he knew that whatever lay ahead, he was ready.